Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 336, covering the week of December 5th through December 9th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab and our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. The YouTube page really is invaluable. We have so much stuff on there, and it's a great resource. All the material there, of course, is free of charge. We have our lectures, we have our Abbeville U videos, we have this podcast, we have some shorts we've done. So you want to grab that YouTube page and watch what we have there. And of course, while you're on the YouTube page, if you click on the little heart under the video, you can support the Institute. That's a great way. It's very easy to do. You can throw a few pennies our way at the Institute. We do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like all the things that we do, our website, our podcast, our videos, our lectures, our conferences, all of that stuff, you can send us a donation, which is tax deductible to the full extent of the law. You can go to abbevilleinstitute.org, click on the donate tab or support tab, and you can do that. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. It is the end of the year. People are making tax considerations, so consider that donation to the Institute. Also want to remind you, we have a Zoom webinar coming up next week, December 15th, on Confederate monuments. This one is free of charge. We're giving it to you free of charge, so come on out there, sign up for that. We only have 500 slots. We probably won't fill it up, but we might get pretty close to it on this one because we are giving it away. So come on out and sign up for that webinar, and you can make a donation there if you would like to support the Institute. You can also pick up our old webinars at abbevilleacademy.org, abbevilleacademy.org. Great website, great resource. We have all of the old webinars there, and you can purchase those. We do have to charge for those because it does cost us money every single month to maintain that part of the website too. So consider buying some of those old lectures or those old webinars. I mean, they're only a year or two old, and they're on great topics. So if you've missed those, go on out there and purchase that stuff as well. You can also download our free mobile app. We have worked on that for a while. It's been off of Apple, the Apple Store. It is going to be back there. I don't know the exact time frame, but it is going to be back up. You can get it on Google Play, so our app is available. That's the Abbeville Institute on the go. You can also support the Institute by making us your preferred Amazon Smile charity. So if you shop at Amazon, make us your Amazon Smile charity. You can support the Institute that way. You can buy our logo and some cool stuff by clicking on the shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. All kinds of great ways to support the show financially or support the Institute financially, all the things that we do. You can also support us painlessly by simply sharing our material around on social media. You can rate this podcast, give it that 5-star review, leave a text review at Apple Podcasts, or if you're on YouTube, leave a comment. All those things help get people noticing the Institute and what we're doing, and that does help grow the organization organically. So we appreciate all of your support. I mean, look, it's like, as I've said before on this show, we're climbing Mount Everest in flip-flops and shorts, and it's a daunting task. We have the entire educational establishment working against us now. If you go out and you look at what's happening online or anywhere else, you're going to see that. This is a very difficult process to try to get our side out there. And simply the Moses Ezekiel monument there in Arlington Cemetery. I mean, this is another issue that we're seeing. Look, the other side has got all the resources. They're doing all the things they can to try to destroy any evidence that the South had a voice in American history. This is their objective because they want to steamroll the other side. It's why they're doing some of the things they are politically, trying to add seats in the Senate, all they can to ensure that they win, and there's no political opposition. There's no opposition to their agenda in any way. Now, if you don't have much punching power, or if you're a smaller organization, they're going to leave you alone pretty much. But we do need to ensure that our position is out there, and everything you can do to support us is part of that mission. So we do want to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. So what is valuable in that tradition? What kind of things do we talk about? Or what kind of things does the Southern tradition offer America today? It may just be at your local level. What kind of things can we do at the state and local level to try to ensure that this tradition, which is really the Jeffersonian tradition, survives? and allows the United States to flourish, or allows your local community to flourish, or your state to flourish. And so all those things are important, and everything you can do to support us, even if it's just talking about what we do, that's supporting the Institute, getting more people interested in what we're doing over here. So again, we do appreciate all of that. We're coming up. This is the next to last podcast for the year. Next week will be the last podcast. I will wrap some things up next week and talking about the year in review. But we had some good stuff this week. Send us contributions if you, as far as written contributions. If you want to see your name in lights on the Abbeville Institute, please send us articles. We will publish things. So we had some people write this week that were not always writers for the Institute, and so we do appreciate all of your support and all of your input. So let's talk about the material for the week, and a lot of good stuff this week on a variety of topics. But I think the thing that comes out of it in many ways is the aggressive nature of the North and characterizing what it means to be an American. So if you look at the first piece of the week, English Fletcher and the Art of Southern Writing. Now, Fletcher was not from North Carolina. She was from Illinois. But she was originally her family was originally from North Carolina. And she found this out. And so later on, she moved back to North Carolina and started writing about her people, her native people, her ancestral people, and her ancestral state. And she produced some of the best pieces of literature on the American War for Independence that you can find, and on early North Carolina. And I think this is amazing that she did this. And I point this out because we've had a couple of great Southern writers on this particular period of time. The first, of course, is William Gilmore Simms, and the second is Fletcher. And these works of historical fiction are valuable because they give us insight into a time and a place, a people in a place. And they're not presentist. They're simply telling a story of this place and these people. I was reading an article this last week, and it was on the war, and it was a mainstream history journal. And it was about a professor that used to require his students to leave out any moral statements in anything they wrote about the war, because he said you cannot judge people from the 19th century by 20th century standards. And this is in the middle of the 20th century that he's doing this. You can't judge people that way. And so if you write these things, he told his graduate students, if you write it this way, I'm going to strike all this out. It's not going to go through me. And unfortunately, what's happened in American history is that everything becomes presentist. Everything has a political angle. Everything has an agenda. And it's not just to understand the people and the place and the time anymore. It's to come up with a way that this can be used as a weapon against someone else. Now, there's a place for that. When you do polemics or you do little short things, there's a place for that. But when you're writing an actual history, even an academic history of a people in a place, your job is to understand and give that person or place or group of people their voice from how they said it. There's a really good book on Philip Pendleton Barber by a man named Belko. And when I say a really good book, it's one of the few books in the modern era, in the last decade, that actually does this. And Belko, I don't think teaches at a university any longer. He did at a small regional university, and then he went on to do some other things. But he did that. He gave Barber a voice without any presentism, and it was refreshing to read. There's a new book coming out on the Jeffersonians by Kevin Gutzman, which does the exact same thing. It is a non-presentist book, and I think that you're all going to enjoy it. I've gotten an advanced copy of it. It's a hefty book, but it's good. He has these very short chapters in it on the main events, if you want to say, in this 24-year period when Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe controlled the executive mansion. And he does a good job of explaining things and saying, well, look, this is just the way it was. And it's not, moral preening or these people were right or these people were wrong. This is what it was. And so when we do that as historians, it's a refreshing departure from the nonsense that we normally get out of the mainstream academy. And that mainstream academy is dominated by New Englanders, maybe not in location, but in attitude. And if you go back and read some of the stuff that has been written, even in the middle of the 20th century into the late 20th century, by some historians who are generally presentists, people like Eric Foner and James McPherson, but Foner in particular in his Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, or Susan Mary Grant, who does a lot of stuff that's in some ways anti-Southern. But you read this stuff and you see the very aggressive nature of the Republican Party in the 1850s. Their goal, and even before that, their goal was to make America in the image of New England. It was their stated goal. It's what they wanted to do. It's what they thought would save the United States. And they started doing this in a way that people picked up on in the North as a crusade in some ways. And there's this image by Thomas Nast of after the war. He painted this picture of Union soldiers. It was 1866. And they're portrayed as crusading knights. And a crusade, a moral crusade to remake and save America. And that's fascinating because that's exactly what's happening in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. And then into the 20th century. And this actually works nicely into Clyde Wilson's piece that we ran on Thursday, Halfbacks. And also Terry Halsey's piece on Wednesday, My Southern Thanksgiving. Clyde's piece on Thursday, the Halfbacks. These are people that he describes as they moved to Florida, they got discontent, and they're not happy in Florida, so they move up to South Carolina or North Carolina. They've gone halfway back to New England. And they really changed things there. And he talks about the academy and how your mainstream Southern institutions, educational institutions, wanted to be a second-rate Ohio State or somewhere else in the North. And they imported all of these Northerners to try to make these schools more like the North. And it's because they have an inferiority complex. Nothing the South can do is great. And I think a lot of this comes out, of course, of the 1950s and 60s, but even before that, when the South was demonized so effectively by the North that they just wanted to be accepted. You can go back to the early 20th century and look at how Southerners reacted to the Spanish-American War or World War I. Just please accept us. Accept us back in the Union. And we love the United States. We love America. We love these things. And we'll fight for it. And we're going to go out and kill the Germans. And we're going to kill the Spaniards. And we're going to do these things in the name of the United States, in the name of democracy and all the stuff that you're saying. We want to be integrated back in the United States. And we're the bad guys. We'll say we were wrong and all these things and just kind of accept us back in. We'll accept Lincoln for what he was. It was that bargain that was cut. But we still want to have our regional identity. Now they've even dropped the regional identity stuff. I mean, that's seen as backwards and hillbillies and hayseeds, which is why Fletcher is so refreshing. Here you have her writing these books in the 1940s, 50s, into the 60s, when she wasn't trying to do that. There were still Southerners in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that were still very proud of being Southerners, or at least people that had ancestral roots in the South who were still very proud of this stuff. And this is something that we've tried to emphasize here at the Institute. The tradition has all kinds of things in it. You don't have to like all of it. You don't have to like the history of the South, right? You don't have to like all the history of the South and everything that's happened there. But being proud of being a Southerner is not a bad thing. It's something to really be proud of. The South has had a tremendous impact on American history and a positive impact on American history. Not just as the people will tell you, and I get this even from Southerners. Well, you are so blind to things. Look at all the nasty things the South did. Well, can we not say the same thing about the North? Can we not say the same thing about other parts of the United States, California? I mean, can we not say those things? Of course we can. But those are often ignored because the South has all these dark things in its history. And as Don Livingston has pointed out, the Southern tradition is now just race and slavery. And that's incorrect. There's so much to offer, and that's why we do things on literature, for example, because Southern literature really is a beautiful side of the Southern tradition. Also, Southern music is why we've done that. as this beautiful side of the Southern tradition. There's only a beautiful tradition can produce those kinds of things. If you don't have a vibrant tradition, you cannot have the arts. And the South has had the arts in its pocket for a long time. A tradition, a people, a culture has to have a vibrancy to produce those things. And that's why we talk about this stuff on the podcast and on the website quite a bit. Or, food ways, Southern cooking. Everybody wants to eat Southern cooking. Who talks about eating New England cooking? Now, we can get into that with Thanksgiving. At Thanksgiving, we brought this up in that special episode we ran during the week of Thanksgiving. Our concept of Thanksgiving is certainly a Yankee concept. And the way that we celebrate it now, even the food, pumpkin pie and these kind of things. Pumpkin spice, all that comes out of the North. And of course, it is good stuff, right? A pumpkin pie or pumpkin spice flavored things are delicious. But that certainly is a Northern conception of this. And this piece by Terry Halsey, his Southern Thanksgiving, he talks about this journey in his life of becoming disillusioned with the South and then coming back to it, and how vibrant that tradition was, and how when he started thinking about those things and those family connections and those roots that had been buried in the soil there, just like Fletcher, he started coming back to it and realizing that this tradition is really who he was. And that goes back to the title of a book Emmy Bradford wrote, Remembering Who We Are. Don't forget those roots and those things that are important. Don't forget those ancestors who are important in who you are. You are their blood. And this is what, Clyde talks about in Halfbacks. And Southerners were willing to trade all of that for simple recognition by the North. And it's sad. In a way, it's really sad that they were willing to do that. And so being proud of being Southern is nothing to be ashamed of. It's something that's a beautiful part of American history. There would be no America without the South. I used to say that a lot on this podcast in the early days in 2015, 16, and 17. The South is America. Well, it is. And this is something that we're doing with the 1607 project, which I haven't talked a lot about. We're really working on that now. We've got the trailer out for it. A lot of the essays have been completed for it. We're going to be putting the book out. We're going to do a documentary on it. The idea is to shift the narrative away from this proposition nation ideology that saturated the United States and start talking about things as they were and how important traditional elements are to American society, organic things, and a lot of that comes out of the South. I'm going to tell you, people in the North or leftists or even centralizers, if they're on the right, don't like this because it is a different kind of narrative of America, and it's not something that's going to fit very nicely into their agenda to centralize power and do all they can to create this kind of New England culture in America. The South and the way that people thought about America was for a long time driven by this Southern tradition. You go back to David Crockett and the Alamo, and even Daniel Boone, though he was born in Pennsylvania, spent most of his life in the South, and so Southerners often claim him. But that coonskin cap, that Jeffersonian view of America, this is when Ben Franklin goes over to Europe, and there's the one painting of Franklin in a coonskin cap. Well, Franklin never wore that, but it's how Parisianers, it's how people in France thought about America. It was this wild frontier, and Southerners did that more than anyone else. It's George Rogers Clark and the conquest of the Old Northwest. It's this kind of thing that really drove how people conceptualize of the United States. Alexis de Tocqueville spending a lot of time on the frontier. That's the important part of this Jeffersonian Southern tradition, this rugged individualism, these things that make the South such a vital part of the American story. And so then we have, of course, the piece on Tuesday by Mark Andrew Holochek, which is really good, and it talks about Jefferson. Now, this gets into the Southern tradition, a part of it that's often, as he talks about, a straw man. And that straw man is, well, the South and race, the South and slavery. You see, so this letter gets into that idea of the fire bell in the night, and it covers this Missouri question, in which Jefferson is often citing, oh my gosh, he was worried about the Union because of slavery in Missouri. And as Holochek points out, well, wait a second here. He was really concerned about the nature of the general government in this. I mean, that was an important part of it. The general government was going to be abusing power, and he was concerned about that long term. And so that was the highlight of the letter. But he also talks about diffusion, and he's bringing up slavery and what to do with it. Jefferson was always a diffusionist. So was Jefferson Davis. And the argument simply was, and this gets into the northern view of slavery and slavery extension and their argument against the slave power. Jefferson's argument was, well, if you diffuse it out, it's going to eventually go away because, and Halbacks makes a nice 3-point argument on this. He says, with greater diffusion of slaves, the practice of slavery is less visible. With lesser visibility of the practice of slavery, the motivation to keep alive that practice is much diminished, and then by diminishing the motivation to keep alive the practice of slavery, we speed up its demise. And he said this is a cogent argument. This is a very cogent argument. It's what Jefferson's argument was. And Jefferson Davis pointed out in all these arguments in the 1850s against slavery extension of the territories, it really wasn't slavery extension. It was simply moving slaves from one place to another. You didn't extend slavery. You simply just brought slaves from one place to another. And by doing that, ultimately, you're going to weaken the institution in the states where it already existed. And you're going to weaken its influence there. And you're going to ultimately lose the institution. It's the Jeffersonian argument. It's the way to get rid of it is to spread it out. Now, Northerners realize that by doing this, you might create a situation where you have more quote-unquote slave states. And that would then lead to greater conflict, or at least lessening their power over things like banks and federally funded internal improvements and tariffs. They couldn't get this stuff if you had more states to vote against them. It was all about political power. This is what I mentioned at the onset of this program, how political power is still part of the mission of those who want to go after the Southern tradition. They want to lessen it and weaken it because they know the South and rural America, which is very Southern influenced, as there's been articles written about this, how much the rural America is influenced by the Southern tradition. That Southern tradition butts heads with what they really want to do. And so when you don't have as many states that can vote against you, you can simply do what you want through the center. And this is what the real issue in the 1850s was all about. It's about political power. Political power. And you have to eliminate any kind of opposition to that political power. And so I love this piece because Halbacks doesn't pull any punches. He says, look, the real part of this is Jefferson's insistence that a state can't be coerced by the federal government. That was the most important part of this letter. That was the real fire bell in the night. What are we doing? When can the general government go in and tell a state what it can do? It can't do that. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows the general government to do this. And that was James Monroe's position as well as president during the Missouri controversy. You can't go in and tell a state what it can do with its domestic institutions. And slavery was considered a domestic institution outside the purview of the general government. It didn't have any power over this. And as Gutzman points out in his book, Henry Clay was, and this is known, but he does a nice job explaining this very succinctly and in a short chapter. Henry Clay was kind of taken aback by this. As Speaker of the House, he said, wait a second here. This isn't even the general government can't do any of this. What are we talking about here? And of course, it was proposed by a one-term congressman from New York. And the idea was to try to break the power of the South in the Congress and to really rile this thing up, not for moral reasons or ideological reasons, but for political power. This is why these people do this stuff. And Jefferson, the fire bell in the night was not, oh my gosh, we're worried about slavery. No, it was they're worried about what the North is going to do here. He's worried about what's going to happen in the Congress. These people are stupid. They're going after something they shouldn't even be talking about. And that was the fire bell in the night. The death knell of the Union would have been federal interference in state issues. And, look, this was a state issue, whether we like it or not in the 21st century. That's what it was. And we have to understand, you have to look at history from the people of the time and not from our own perspective on what we like and we don't like about American society or American history. This is what happened. So I like this piece because I think he does a great job pointing out Jefferson's, he calls it a cogent argument. And he says, look, there's a reason why scholars on the other side create a straw man. And this straw man is this: by spreading out the number of slaves over a larger territory, one does nothing to reduce the number of slaves. By not acting to reduce the number of slaves, we do nothing to work toward riddance of slavery, so diffusion will do nothing to end slavery. And he says, look, it's a straw man. It doesn't even work. If you do spread something out and diffuse it and you make it less visible, it eventually will go away. I think this is it's a straw man fallacy that they're pointing out, and I think Jefferson's argument is pretty cogent. Now, the other side would say, well, they spread it out in the Deep South, and look what it did. It just grew and festered and got bigger and bigger, and that was diffusing it from Virginia into the southern states. But again, outside of eastern Texas, in the 1860s, you didn't have any cotton-producing areas. They weren't going to grow cotton in Kansas and Nebraska. They weren't going to grow cotton in Arizona and New Mexico or Southern California. That wasn't going to happen. And Jefferson Davis and Southerners, I think, were generally willing to allow the Missouri Compromise line to just stretch out to the Pacific and just have access to those southern territories. North said no to all of it. And they had a vested interest in this because there were parts of the South that were heavily populated with slaves, and they thought that by spreading this out, this also worked. This was better for both groups of people in those areas as well. So it's a complicated argument that they're making, and I think in simplistic terms is what we'd like to see. Well, this is spreading slavery. It's spreading slavery. That's the easiest knee-jerk reaction to this, but as a much more nuanced argument comes from Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson Davis. What they're actually doing here is diffusing slavery and making it less visible. So, but again, when you have this Charles Sumner northern-dominated view of the United States, to make America New England again, you can't have any of this. And this even goes into people that lived in the North. And the last article of the week, Reverend William S. Plummer, Union trader or faithful preacher, Plummer would not come out in favor of the war during the war. He wouldn't say anything positive about the Union. He simply prayed for peace. And so that led to a charge of being a traitor. He wasn't in line with the standard narrative coming out of the North that we must do all we can to pray for our brave Union boys in blue and get these Southern devils. Well, Plummer had spent some time in the South. He wasn't from the South, but he had spent time in the South. And he understood that Southerners were not devils, that Southerners were not evil people. They had differences of opinion. They did things that maybe others didn't care for. But they weren't evil people. And so that's where Plummer was essentially run out of town. You couldn't have this kind of heresy in the North during the war. And Plummer was forced to resign from teaching positions. He just was not accepted. And you find that, again, a lot during the war. It's a difference of opinion. It's not going to be tolerated. This is where dissenters in the North many of them were thrown in jail. You had people attacked and physically abused by Northerners who were not going to tolerate any form of dissent, any type of opposition to the Lincoln administration, or not even just opposition, but just not saying they're pro-union or they're pro-boys in blue. If you just were generally vanilla on it and saying, I'm going to pray for peace. I'm going to pray for that we end this war. I want peace. Well, that's not good enough. You're not saying the right things. You're not waving the bloody shirt. You're not doing the things that we require of you when it comes to doing all you can to promote the side of the Union. And so Plummer was persona non grata in the North. And again, this is part of that kind of cultural imperialism that we see coming out of New England. You have to toe the line and be exactly what they are, or you're not going to be accepted. And look, you could find this stuff in the South too. I'm not going to say the South didn't do these kind of things. But Southerners, on some issues, were a little more tolerant than others. Certainly, again, you can find areas where they were not tolerant. But regardless, during the war itself, as was pointed out in the early stages in particular, Southerners allowed for dissent. Southerners allowed for people who weren't Confederacy or they were against the Davis administration. You had a lot of Unionists in the South, and you had a lot of people criticizing the Davis administration and what the Confederate government was doing. In fact, so much so that this was seen as a weakness in the Confederacy during the war. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. And again, it gets into this idea of what is the Northern tradition, what is the Southern tradition, and how important those things are. But I liked every piece this week. I thought they were all fantastic. And we've got one more podcast for 2022. We'll be doing that, wrapping up the year next week. So until next time, good day.